This year's theme is 2020 Spiritual Vision. Our theme for August is Inclusion in Action. We are a spiritual community that celebrates diversity, fosters inclusion, champions inner work, and creates space for brave, vulnerable conversations. Today's topic is We Are. New Thought author Dennis Merritt Jones wrote in The Art of Being, I believe there is something within each of us that is aching for authentic spiritual connection to actually know what God's presence feels like. Spiritual community is where this happens. Why? Because it creates an environment where everyone feels commonly, communally, and equally embraced in the loving presence of God. It magnifies the experience. Each one actually becomes a reflector for the other, magnifying God's magnificence and love. Henry Nouwen wrote, community is first of all a quality of the heart. Community is the fruit of our capacity to make the interest of others more important than our own. The question, therefore, is not how we can make community, but how can we develop and nurture giving hearts? Let's speak and know this truth together. I love well. I see the holiness in all life and understand that oneness is not sameness. Therefore, I celebrate our uniqueness and diversity. I advocate for inclusion. I stand for the dignity and human rights of all. I love well. And now we turn this over to Reverend Kathleen. Oh, we can't hear you.
All right. I'd like to begin with a story by Alan Cohen that takes place in some place where there's a jungle. That's all I know. He doesn't say, but he tells the story of having a parrot by the name of Yogi. And one day a gust of wind took Yogi off into the distance and down into the valley of the jungle. And Alan went looking for him and found him in a tree next to this man. He calls him a mountain man by the name of Tom. And this mountain man lived on a wooden pallet with a tarp draped over top of it. And here he is in the middle of the jungle, and he has a TV hooked up to a car battery, and he's watching the news. Well, this man who is a hermit and who has renounced the world is watching the news on TV in the jungle. And so as Alan approaches, he sees Alan and he turns to him and he says, Armageddon is on its way. Just take a look at what's on the news right now. He said that the Bible tells us that these are end times. So it turns out, after Alan talks to Tom, that he finds out that he has been watching the news consistently. So here he is, away from the so-called away from the world, watching the news, immersed in it, and carrying the heaviness of it with him in his heart. In the Honeymooners, I don't know how many of you remember that show, a long time ago, Ed Norton was fired from his job working in the sewer department. And so this is like a line that mostly everybody remembers. What he said to Ralph Cramden at the time was, you can take the man out of the sewer, but you can't take the sewer out of the man. And this is a very profound statement when you think about it, because the heaviness of the world was existing in this man Tom, even though he'd been taken out, so-called out of the world and into a paradise type setting. By contrast, Alan tells the story of his spiritual teacher by the name of Hilda. Now, Hilda lived in New York City, and she lived in one of the toughest sections of that city. Daily, on a daily basis, she came into contact with drug addicts and with prostitutes, with thieves, with people who were in despair, and the light that was in her transformed everyone she met. Hilda was a person who carried the light of heaven within her, even though she was not in that what you could call a heavenly setting. So you can take the person out of heaven, but you can't take the heaven out of the person if that's what they've cultivated in their hearts. Reading this story really got me to contemplate, because I have to admit, I've carried some of the heaviness of what's going on in the world right now with me. I've been tuning into the news more than I normally would, and it's really not all that much, but enough to just know what's going on. And so I don't know whether you're in the same situation or not, but if you have, here's the choice that we have. We have that same choice that the mountain man and Hilda made. So we can choose to carry heaven in our hearts and minds, or to carry hell or heaviness in our hearts and minds. That's our choice. And so it depends on our thoughts, and it depends on the perspectives that we choose. As I was thinking about some of the things that are going on in our world, I was thinking about this whole concept of us versus them, and how incredibly competitive and heavy it is to live in that state of mind. And the perspective of us versus them, think about it. It's fearful, it's closed. There's a tendency to close the mind. I'm on this side and that's it. It's closed, it's hurtful to self and to others. It's paralyzing, it's negative, and ultimately it's extremely dangerous for our health and for our survival, not as only as individuals, but as communities, as nations, and as humanity. So we can choose instead a heavenly state of mind or consciousness, even in the midst of all that's going on in the world. And so that is what our community is all about, and that's what our month is all about, this idea of inclusion in action. It's really putting our teachings into action. So here's the thing that I am coming to grips with, is that we live in a world that I believe is starved for spiritual connection, for connection with God, whatever word you want to use for that presence. And what's happening then is, because people are starved for that, they are looking for ways to belong, sometimes in ways that are not very healthy, with groups that maybe have a very fearful base to it. And so I know what we have to offer is food for the soul, the kind of food that will truly satisfy the soul, and that will also cultivate that thing that Hilda cultivated, heaven within our hearts, heaven in this world. So our teaching then liberates us from these hellish, I'm going to use that term, these hellish states of mind, the heaviness that we carry around. This is what attracted me to it. This is what I love about it. And so again, we get to choose. Do we go the way of the mountain man, or do we go the way of Hilda? Our teaching basically has two aspects to it. The first is, I'm going to say, New Thought, Science of Mind, Philosophy. So there's the philosophy. The philosophy has a very personal aspect to it. It is about cultivating our own inner divine connection through meditation, through prayer, through journaling. And it also, and part of that philosophy is also learning to use spiritual principle, learning to use the creative power of the mind. This is a God-given superpower that we're all given, that we can use. And if we use it unconsciously by focusing on all that's negative, we're always creating, we're creating what we don't want. So this is about, even though whatever is going on in the world, we want to bring a higher vision and use our creative powers to do that. So that's the personal aspect of our teaching, and it's a focus on consciousness. Consciousness is the core of our teaching, that when we change our consciousness, change the belief structure that we carry in the consciousness, change our focus, change our intention, then we change our lives. And so the skillful use of that is moving from victim consciousness, we talked about the different levels of consciousness, into manifestor consciousness. So it's a necessary step to stabilize our lives. So New Thought, Ancient Wisdom knows how. We who have been in this teaching for a while know how to change consciousness, don't we? We know that it begins by facing and identifying false beliefs. Beliefs in lack and limitation. We know that next it's basically saying to those false beliefs, you have no power. You are not the truth. And then it's about casting a new vision, which I was just talking about. What is it that we choose in our lives and in our world? And then it's affirming that it's already happening with boldness and with conviction. Our affirmations that are in present tense, personal and powerful. And then we know that it's about taking consistent action toward our dreams. Action is a really important part. We talk about treat and move your feet. Do your prayer, which we call spiritual mind treatment, and move your feet. So while the New Thought philosophy, the creative process, is very personal, the theological aspect of our teaching is communal. It's about understanding our relationship with the divine, our oneness in God. We live, move, and have our being in God, and we are an expression, an extension of that presence. God is not an individual out there somewhere in this teaching. There's an understanding that God is universal intelligence that is omnipresent. Omnipresent. And it means that our our relationship is one of belonging to the whole and everything in the whole belonging to each other. So our principle of oneness then exists in our theology. The principle of oneness exists in this theology, oneness. So learning to manifest, of course, we said is gets us to a certain point, the manifestor stage. Yet if we stop there, we're missing out on so much more. In fact, stopping there and saying, well, I'll create my little world and we'll let everybody else create their little world, is not understanding the oneness principle. So what is the radical implication of the oneness principle? This is it. It's that I am not an island. You are not an island. No one is truly an island. There is no them out there. Yes, we're all individualized expressions, but because we are all so interconnected, when we get into that thinking of there are them, there's me, and then there's them, that's when we run into trouble. So we are not separate from this oneness of God, this oneness of humanity. We exist in community. whether we like it or not. We truly do. We exist in community. We exist in interconnection. And our environment recently has been teaching us that in bold letters, in bold colors. So oneness theology then implies a world that works for all. It implies that we are all in this together. And then we come when we move into this state, and these are the higher states of God through me and God as me, unity with the one. When we come from that place, we realize that the question is, how can I serve? And how can I serve in a way that supports the highest good of all beings? Not only humanity, but the entire planet. So this is pure oneness theology. This is not a political perspective. I want to make that very clear. This is pure oneness theology. So New Thought Science of Mind is also a certain kind of theology. It's called liberation theology. And liberation theologies throughout time have come about in response to oppressive theology. So it's not just ours that does that, but there are others as well. And so the idea is that the theology is about the liberation of humanity from the bondage of oppressive thinking that's based in fear and physical force. So New Thought then came about as a spiritual movement in the mid-1800s in response to the Calvinistic theology of the time. You know, the fire and brimstone, sin, hell, damnation, all of that theology that was rooted in fear. New Thought was birthed as a response to that, and it was looking beyond actually a certain religion to a more global view, a study of Eastern religions as well as Western religion, and looking at the essence teaching of it. Ernest Holmes, when he was a child, remembered a time when his mother took all the children to a local church. They'd moved into a new community, so she decided to take them to the local church. And the minister was one of those hellfire and brimstone types. And so she immediately removed the children. And on the way home, Ernest recalls her saying that do not believe what that minister taught. He was teaching fear. In our family, we teach love. Powerful memory, that you can see was one of the impetuses behind the direction that he took later in his life. So what is missing then in these theologies of oppression, of fear, is truly an understanding of what love is, which is based in oneness, the principle of oneness, the idea of original blessing instead of original sin, and the idea of our connection to the all that is. God is all there is, not God is some individual out there. God is omnipresence. And so there are three basic tenets of liberation theology. There is the solidarity of all people, with solidarity with all people, meaning the common people, the oppressed, our solidarity with them. You can see that in our movement, how we have embraced social justice and equality. These are things that are part of this theology, liberation theology. And also that the second tenet is oppression is unnatural, that freedom is our natural state. And the third tenet is that this teaching is one that uplifts. The intention is to uplift and to liberate from oppressive beliefs in lack and limitation. So in our community, there's a lot of joy and there's a lot of laughter and there's a lot of fun because it's all about empowering that heavenly state within us, using the creative power of the mind and of our connection with the all that is and our realization that we are all in this together. So what we deeply believe, our philosophy and our theology, and what we claim for ourselves, for our communities, for our nation, for our world, has an impact. What we do in our community and as individuals has an impact because we're all one. As we raise our frequency, we raise the frequency of the entire planet. So as co-creators with God, we have a tremendous gift. And being conscious co-creators, we have a tremendous gift and we have a responsibility to live the oneness principle to the very greatest extent that we possibly can. So living that principle means that we embrace diversity and inclusion, that we actively celebrate diversity and build inclusive relationships, cross-racial relationships, relationships with people that are unlike us. And it means also that we help to build new structures in our organizations, in our communities, and in our countries that support diversity and inclusion. Also that we unify through spirit. You know, in the act of baptism that's used in the Christian tradition, there is a sacred covenant that is made. And metaphysically, you know, from our perspective, it symbolizes new life that springs from awakening to our oneness with the divine and with all life. So these rituals are so important to the soul. And also living the oneness principle is inclusion as a way of life, practicing inclusion, being conscious, am I being inclusive? So a commitment to living the oneness inclusion principle is similar to the metaphysical meaning behind baptism. And yet it is not a one and done trick. It's a beginning. It's a beginning, okay? And what it means is that we know that those who are baptized still have doubts. Those who take vows in other religious traditions like Buddhism realize that there are still going to be inner challenges. And yet we know that we can return to our commitment to inclusion over and over and over again and remind ourselves until it becomes such an embodiment that it's a natural way of being. So this is how I'm going to invite us all to make that commitment together as a community. I'd like us now to express our commitment to the oneness principle and inclusion in a very tangible way. And it's called the CSL Delaware Statement of Inclusion. And so Dan is going to go to the other room now and project it on the screen. And I'm going to invite, actually, when we do this, let's speak this with boldness and conviction because it activates the inner realm and it also creates collective change. So here are our folks that are going to be supporting us in this, people from the social justice team. Christy Gonzalez, Amish Shah, Jen Lyons, and Bruce Tatum and Virgie Cooper will take the lead. So I'd like everybody, as they speak, to speak it along with them. So it's up on your screen right now. And so Christy, you please begin.
We, the Center for Spiritual Living Delaware, are a community that celebrates diversity, fosters inclusion, champions inner work, and create space for brave, vulnerable conversations.
We are a community that honors the unique emanation of God that each person embodies, advocates with people for human rights and dignity for all.
We are a community that blesses each other, sees holiness in all life, remains learners and listeners so that we can grow together and understand that oneness is not sameness.
And we, the Center for Spiritual Living Delaware, know that the beloved community is revealed when we love each other well.
And so I'd like us all together to say, Aho, Ashe, Amin, Shalom, and so it is. Amen.